Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to St. John's Co-Cathedral. I'm very excited to see so many participants. I have been privileged by being given the first chance to speak. I think I should have been the last to speak, but anyway, the selection was not mine. So I'm going to just give an overview, introduction to what we were doing here at St. John's. So that perhaps we can be a little bit, we can share our knowledge about how to create this equilibrium between spirituality, faith, and cultural tourism and restoration, of course. Our cathedrals were built by our forefathers to honor their faith, our faith. They were constructed with incredible zeal and dedication, and they wanted them to transcend through time and carry their values to the future, whoever may be present at that time. This shows what great foresight our forefathers had. For this reason, we have inherited the responsibility to preserve this heritage and the knowledge that came with it for future generations, and to transmit the same values that have been handed down to us. Every culture has its own particular religious heritage, which makes the world such a beautiful kaleidoscope of faith. Its practices and values often change over time in many ways, but preserving our religious heritage is important because it defines our identity. By conserving our religious heritage, we also get a very good understanding of the history of our culture. You need to know where you're coming from to know where you're going. In this regard, I feel that there are three main challenges that cultural heritage and conservation and sustainability of a religious site has. One, there is the challenge of change. Two, the challenge of sustainable management, and also the challenge of restoration. Change is a phenomenon of time. And in this regard, in connection with the subject, I think that St. John's Co-Cathedral gives a very good example of how these three challenges were implemented to create a beautiful symbiotic relationship between religiosity and tourism. The challenges are many. Firstly, what happens to cult pieces that now have become works of art and may limit the possibility of caring and preserving them? This is where planning and discussion is crucial, because only through dialogue between the conservators and the clergy and those responsible for the spirituality of the cathedral can we create a system which respects both sides of the coin. So this is something that I would like to pass on to you, because unless you preserve the relationships, you will not be able to preserve your cultural objects, your precious cult pieces. Just for a quick background to those who are maybe new to Malta, the Order of St. John built the church as their conventual church, and it was ready by 1577, and the Grand Masters gave gifts of high artistic value, because this is the way that faith was expressed, and in time it became an outstanding treasure house. The numerous artifacts by artists including Caravaggio, Rubens, and Mattia Preti are the main contributors that made this cathedral so special. It is the Baroque age that we are dealing with, and religious fervor was expressed with rich embellishment and perhaps even extravagance to honor God. For this reason, all the walls were carved and gilded with 24-karat gold. St. John's, unfortunately, like many other cathedrals, came to be susceptible to the phenomena of change. So the cathedral, that was once an expression of the knights' faith and also their military achievements, because this is something that they wanted to be remembered for, with changes that were in nobody's control, this is where religious heritage could be in peril. Following the order's expulsion from Malta by Napoleon's troops in 1798, the Bishop of Malta, following Napoleon's instructions, stepped in to use the church as his co-cathedral. Malta, 2 years later, became a British colony. So the maintenance and upkeep of St. John's was transferred to the British government, along with all the other heritage sites in Malta. The church now had to compete with all the other national monuments for attention and could not receive the amount of maintenance that this church deserved. Unfortunately, deterioration set in. Without the proper maintenance, stonework eroded, gilding started to decay because of rising damp and water infiltration, and St. John's started to lose its luster. Adding to this was the new prevailing neoclassical style, because this is also a question of change, where the Baroque style started to be looked upon as distasteful, extravagant, excessive. One case in point was this chapel, the Chapel of France, where, because of the neoclassical style that wanted to simplify art, started to remove the decorative scheme within this chapel. And instead of the wall carvings that had been done in the 1660s, they were replaced with a simple 8-pointed cross. Even the ornate altar by Melchiorre Gaffin, unfortunately, we lost and was replaced by a simple white altar. Luckily, the Maltese congregation got so angry about this that they started to write furiously in newspapers, and they managed to stop it because this scheme was planned for the rest of the church. So this is the consequence of change. In the 1970s, we start to see the rise of tourism. And in 1980, actually, exactly, the city of Valletta was proclaimed a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Obviously, that put it on the cultural map and started to attract a lot more tourists. And this is where we see the character, the attraction, changing from faith, devotion, and prayer to a cultural attraction. The main aspect is, and the challenge to sustain management, is to see how one can start to preserve the cathedral so that it still has the history and the luster of the past, and at the same time still maintain the amount of tours that it was attracting. And the only way was to put it into the market economy and start to charge an entrance fee, because unless you have very benevolent benefactors, it is impossible to sustain the maintenance of this church. In 2001, then, the foundation was set up, again with this amazing synergy between the church and the governments, that obviously they represent the two different pendulums of this church, because obviously one is more interested in the economy and obviously the other is more interested in sustaining the faith. But together, they created this foundation that was to look after St. John's. And the revenue that comes in from the entrance fee goes all to restoration. And this is where then the foundation was able to start having to employ professionals. We now have a curatorial department, we have a conservation department, we have the rector who is part of our team. He shares his desk in our offices, so every day we have the opportunity of dialoguing with him about our faith and spirituality. With that comes the next challenge, the challenge of restoration, because restoration is a costly affair, And for instance, we had to use one of the chapels to bring down certain paintings, which were very large, to be able to use that chapel as a restoration laboratory. Obviously, we spoke to the rector. We decided which period of the year was the best time to be able to do this, and we came into agreement. So always keep in mind that communication and dialogue and preserving the relationships with all the partners is key. Then the foundation launched on a very elaborate restoration project, starting from the exterior, which was in dire need of restoration, setting up scaffolding, and you have to set up scaffolding in a way that doesn't block the entrance, so that members of the public, worshippers on Saturday and Sunday, can enter freely. And then there were chapels that had to be closed one at a time so that the walls could be restored and regilded. There were other works of art, the tapestries that you are seeing hanging today. They were also in dire need of restoration. You can see the damage that they had sustained. And these tapestries were sent to Belgium until all 29 pieces were restored. This is one of the restorers. You can see the delicate work that she is undertaking. And there were also the tombstones. I'm just mentioning 3 different phases because obviously they were the ones which are most laborious and most time-consuming and costly. Well, what I can say now is that since St. John's has been restored and is now being preserved and maintained, it is actually attracting more cultural events. For instance, this is a concert of sacred music. It is also now a more precious place of divine worship. These are the young novices being ordained. This is the investiture of the Knights of Malta. And this is the ordination of bishops, which also takes place. We also have a lot of state events, and we also welcome a lot of VIPs to St. John's. So St. John's now is up there with all the other major cathedrals. In fact, sometimes to joke with my colleagues, I say, when somebody important comes, first he goes to see the Prime Minister, then he comes to see me. These are the Knights, for instance. The Knights now are beginning to have their celebrations here, and all this pomp and ceremony, which the foundation supports greatly, because this is also our intangible heritage. Without these events, without the liturgical events, St. John's will be just another empty place. So this is something that, this is a concept that we need to keep in forefront in our mind. The major expenditure was on the regilding of the cathedral. As you can see, it cost 6.5 million euros, 2,300 square meters of gold, and 8 kilos of gold leaf. It was the most important element because gold has also a spiritual value, because gold represents light, light represents truth, and truth represents God. I'm now going to pass on the microphone to my colleague, Dr. Adriana Alessio, who will give you an insight of the delicate procedure of gilding.
Good morning, all. Buongiorno a tutti. My presentation today, as Ms. De Giorgio anticipated before, is focus the attention on the restoration of the gilded and polychrome surfaces of the chapels and the arches at St. John's Co-Cathedral. In particular, I will focus the attention on the treatment of the large losses and the procedures and process that led to achieve this balance between conservation and spirituality. When the foundation of St. John's Co-Cathedral was established in 2001, the need for restoration was already evident and urgent, since the decorated surfaces had been strongly affected by several deterioration which were caused primarily by the infiltration of the rainwater from the apertures above the dome of each chapels, and the phenomena of the capillary rising damp, which had led to many other mechanisms of deterioration. The result, at the end, was the loss of the greatest part of the gilding, polychrome surfaces, until 3 meters high from the floor, and the greatest loss of the decoration of the domes. The first chapels to be restored was the Chapel of Italy. Here, a team of conservators, art historians, scientists, in continuous dialogue with the foundation management, the director of works, and the prorector, established what would have been the pilot project, useful also for the further restoration of the other chapels. To design the restoration intervention, of course, a first phase of study was needed. These included the identification of the original materials and the manufacture techniques, the evaluation of the state of conservation, understanding the causes of deterioration, the identification of past intervention, distinguishing between the historical stratification and any other additional materials, the mapping and the documentation of all data acquired, and the comparison between scientific data and macro observation of the surfaces, and of course tests carried out in situ. This complex and beautiful setting, typical of the Baroque architectures, consists of bas-reliefs, realized carving the local Maltese globicerina limestone, which was then embellished with the application of gold leaf. According to the scientific analysis and the stratigraphy that you can see on the slide, the stone was first treated with a coat of linseed oil used like a primer, followed by a second white preparatory layer to isolate the following layers. This was composed mainly of calcite mixed with yellow ochre and a protein-based glue, most probably animal glue. Then a third layer, which consists of the preparation layer of the gilding, was composed of red or yellow ochre, raw sienna, mixed again with animal glue. In those chapels or area where also the water-based gilding was found, of course, the analysis detected also the presence of substrate of gypsum covered by red bolo. Regarding the polychrome surfaces, a smalt blue was detected for the decoration of the blue backgrounds of every walls and pilasters, whilst the cinnabar was the main red used for the decorations like the Lion of La Castière or the coat of arms, and the lead white was the, or biacca, was used for the white. Also, considering the extremely hygroscopic characteristics of the globicerina, the lead white was used to waterproof the stone blocks and insulate for the subsequent pictorial layers. Lead white diluted with oil has been found through also XRF investigation, as well as in the preparation of all surfaces to be painted and also used as a single pigment. In this slide, you can see non-invasive technique and multispectral analysis. In particular, is the infrared in false color, where it's easy to recognize this smalt blue that under infrared false color became that nice pink, and the red, the cinnabar, become those that yellow-orange color. So once the building was secure, I mean, once all the apertures were well sealed, it was possible to start finally with the restoration interventions. Every year, chapels by chapel were restored. The restoration interventions included some important operations. First of all, the graphic and photographic documentation. As you can see, it was used to map and to localize any sort of deterioration causes, so the state of conservation of the artifact, presence of past intervention, and any other technical aspect. Then we can see the removal of deposit, of dust, or any other additional materials no longer compatible with the original materials. The treatment against also microbiological growth. Here there are some images showing the gold leaf found beneath a layer of varnish, a layer of what we call, it was a protective coat most probably, and we managed to find the original gold and also the original polychromy. The pre-consolidation, meaning the readhesion of the painted and gilded surfaces, the cleaning test for gold leaf and also for the stone exposed to the element. This one was really important to understand the level of cleaning they could achieve, not only in an area, but to all the surfaces. Then other treatment were focused on the stabilization of the stone support, so operational like the extraction of soluble salt, consolidation, grouting, infills. In some cases, stone blocks were also replaced to create a surface more homogeneous possible. Once these operations were concluded, of course, the attention moved to the aesthetic presentation, the problem of the aesthetic presentation of the artifact. So it was important to decide which criteria to use for the reintegration of the losses, of the lacuna, both for the polychromies and the gilding. Regarding the polychrome surfaces, this shows, of course, several losses with different size. Considering not recommendable to use the same materials of the originals, because as we saw in the previous slide, the preparatory layer was composed of organic, natural resins, no reversible and not suitable for proper conservation treatment. And instead, following the theory of restoration, all lacuna of the painted layers were integrated with watercolors and using a mimetic technique. So glazes of watercolor were applied where the surfaces were affected by salt fluorescence, for example, whilst the modular or geometric patterns were reconstructed with a mimetic technique. So in this case, we use a mimetic technique using different materials like the watercolor that are more stable than other pigments. When this operation was concluded, again, the questions move to the treatment of the gilding. The topic of the treatment of the large losses required a complex debate and concerned questions of technical and philological nature. As Mrs. De Giorgio said, the cathedral used to shine thanks to its gold, applied in this extraordinary quantity. And the tridimensionality of the shapes was used to emphasize the light, to reflect the light, giving to St. John's that iconic and material presence, so that the wall apparatus was no less important than the rest of the decorative apparatus of the church. In the field which concerned the integration of gold, it was made a difference between movable and non-movable artifacts. About not movable artifacts, such as the bas-relief of St. John's, with this extensive surface, it was decided to reconstruct the losses with a technique similar to the original. And the reason was to recreate the same brightness, the same reflection of lights, which otherwise we will not have using a pictorial technique or other materials generally used to integrate the gold, to imitate the gold. So when it comes to decorative apparatus of ceilings, stuccos or bas-relief, attention must be paid on the documentation. Nowadays it's possible thanks to the modern restoration, which includes diagnostic analysis, graphic and photographic documentation before, during, and after the intervention. So the documentation became mandatory, as well as the presence of a scientific committee composed by professionals who are called to take a decision and to identify the right methodology with responsibility. On the other hand, restoration such as that one of St. John's Co-Cathedral was done in many other monuments in Europe. We can talk about the Real Casar of Seville, or the Mirror Gallery of Palazzo Doria Pamphili in Rome, or the Mirror Gallery of Versailles. In this place, the gilding was always integrated using the same kind of gold of the original. And this is why, to reconstruct the splendor and the value of the place. So the operation were executed at St. John's was respecting the place as a religious place, from the setting up of the scaffolding to the general operation. The intention was to do not affect the liturgy as well as any other cultural event host at St. John's. Our duty today is to preserve and maintain not only the original, but also the reconstruction, to minimize the future intervention only where is strictly necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going straight to the point to keep up with the tight schedule. Object of cult or cultural heritage object. A path for decision making. What defines an object of cult? In the Baroque novel Adventurus Simplicissimus, the protagonist exclaims, "None pleased me better than an ecce homo, because its representation of pity, by which it stirred the beholder to compassion." The value he perceives as a Christian believer is the representation of the ecce homo is lost to the collector, who values instead the economic gain of a rarer art piece. The Christian tradition has always tapped into the potential of art as an effective tool for evangelization, thus going beyond its liturgical and cultural meanings. Such art is infused with religious beliefs as artists translate sacred texts and oral traditions into visual art forms. These artistic expressions are often found to be at the center of ritual and cult practices. The use of art as a sacrament that unites the believer to God is emphasized by Pope John Paul II, who states that the Church has called the arts to serve the liturgy, entrusting it with the task of assisting in man's dialogue with God. Their beauty lures the onlooker into contemplation and prayer as the dual nature of God, truly God and truly man, is physically depicted either directly or through his saints. The artwork thus becomes the means through which, by attempting to portray the beauty of the divine, the believer is directed by the artist to engage spiritually with God. The artworks located in a place of worship are envisioned from their conception with a particular function which goes beyond the mere purpose of embellishment, but is inherent to the religious cult itself. Within such sacred places, artistic expression and religious feelings interact, thus playing an active role in the rites and rituals of the community. Such art was also meant to provide a didactic means of evangelization, as well as acting as a witness to the charitable works. Artwork in this form gains a wider meaning as it encompasses all the various objects of cult which populate places of worship. One such example are the most venerated relics and reliquaries. These complex art forms have been present in liturgical celebrations of the Church since the first centuries of Christianity. Their use is described as a result of an instinctive, reverent approach towards remnants or heirlooms of the dead. Relics are not considered as being in themselves powerful, but due to their intrinsic link to the saint, sanctified by the power of God, the relic itself is thus made holy. The Council of Trent, as a reaction to the Protestant Reformation, rekindled the importance of such relics, emphasizing the need to exhibit them in full glory for the veneration of the faithful. The design and ostentatious aesthetic of the reliquaries were a direct physical expressions of the response to the request made by the bishops in the various synods for the conservation of relics to take place with great dignity. Reliquaries, thus, take an important dual role, the first of accentuating the relic, and the second of acting as an interlocutor, allowing the community to engage with the saint. Holy powers were attributed to such relics, and thus physical contact is seen as a powerful tool for invoking intercession. This credence can be traced back to the depths of Christianity or Christian faith, as illustrated in the Holy Scriptures, the inspired Word of God. Such customs are still prevalent in communities such as those in Malta, which goes as far as forming part of the identity of society. Such contact with the relic, including kissing, touching, and bestowing of precious gifts ex voto, evokes personal expressions of faith and thus gives a personal dimension to the spiritual meaning. On the other hand, the community in procession, accompanied by various external parallel festive elements, such as street decorations, fireworks, and marching bands, represent the cultural value in meaning for the whole community. The devotion, zeal, enthusiasm, and fervor has passed from one generation to another, marking in gold the identity and roots of a people. One can thus see how objects of this kind, valorized in themselves as being of cultural heritage value, are in the first instance objects of cult, having an intrinsic role within the religious community. Defining the cultural heritage object. The value of artworks has for long been appreciated, and thus their classification as objects worthy of conservation is by now uncontested. We must dare to look beyond the limiting term artwork when attempting to define the term objects of conservation or cultural heritage objects. Many have tried to prescribe meanings to this classification of objects such as heritage, cultural property, historic objects, or archaeological objects, artworks, or antiquities, to name a few common examples. There seemed to be no agreement among authors on finding common factors behind the category of conservation objects. An example of this discord was the inevitability to define this term during the 1992 Dahlem Conference on Durability and Change, the Science, Responsibility, and Cost of Sustaining Cultural Heritage. Various contemporary writings have delved into the reason why certain objects are classified as worthy of preservation. One clear model, which is often cited in various studies, is Mikulski's three-dimensional object value space. In this model, three kinds of meanings are represented as the main attributes of value. These are the object's scientific meaning, its impersonal narrative meaning, and lastly, its personal narrative meaning. Munoz Viñas further elaborates on the importance of meaning by sustaining that it provides a good criterion for understanding why some objects are considered conservation objects. He also implies that meaning forms the basis of the attribution of commercial value together with what he refers to as object's function. Furthermore, one may refer to the value of authenticity outlined in the Nara document, which highlights other dimensions that contributes to meaning, namely form and design, material and substance, use and function, traditions and techniques, location and settings, and spirit and feeling, and other internal and external factors. When considering the criteria put forth in both the NARA document and the Barra Charter, this level of meaning becomes crucial in the understanding and interpretation of the object values. Such values are culturally specific in that, as also seen in Mikalki's model, the importance of meaning attributed to an object depends greatly on the community and individuals appreciating it. Context, therefore, plays an important part not just in the physical, but also in the social, spiritual, and historical perspectives. Other writings refer to the dimension of meaning as the intangible significance of a cultural object. Reference is often made to in the UNESCO International Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage to emphasize the need to strengthen the long-recognized ties between the tangible forms and the intangible values towards a guided rationale for decision-making. The focus when seeking to preserve a cultural heritage object should thus not be to conserve material for its own sake, but rather to maintain and shape the values embodied by the heritage. The whole purpose of conservation is to reduce the pace of change by preventing or reversing certain types of progress. Changes should not only be considered in physical terms, but as seen repetitively, it should encapsulate all aspects of the artifact in question, including both tangible and intangible values. Conservation strategies are aimed at reducing the risks threatening the preservation of the integrity of heritage. The Barra Charter introduces the notion of cultural significance and emphasizes that any intervention which is to bring about change is to respect all aspects of this cultural significance. The term respect, with reference to objects of cultural significance, features in many authoritative ethical principles and guidelines, such as those issued by UNESCO, ECHO, and the AIC, for instance. Article 5 of the ECHO Professional Guidelines advocates that the conservation restorer shall respect the aesthetic, historical, and spiritual significance and the physical integrity of the cultural heritage entrusted to her or his care. This term, however, lacks an explicit definition, thus being widely open to interpretation. This vagueness represents a source of confusion for the conservation professionals. One definition put forth defines respect as a form of meaning preservation that targets not so much the material object as the relationship between people and communities that revolve around these objects. What is the reason for such a lack of guidelines and charters for conservation professionals faced with this issue? Stovall, in his introduction to the proceedings from ICROM 2003, Forum on Living Religious Heritage Conserving the Sacred, attributes this to the possible perception in the conservation world that responsibility for religious heritage rests with the religious community, or that the religious context is too sensitive for conservation professionals to treat with objectivity and fairness. Or it may be due simply to a lack of systematic attention to this type of heritage. Attempts have been made to address this issue by creating checklists, such as the Victoria and Albert Museum Ethics Checklist, to stimulate the conservation professional into thinking about all aspects of the object prior to devising any sort of conservation strategy or policy. This solution, however, lacks in the contextualization and personalization, thus missing the mark and guiding towards the creation of a bespoke code of ethics for the object in question. The aim of this study is thus to provide an objective guide to the conservation professional faced with the challenge of understanding the value of a conservation object. It aims to address the current necessity for professionals to resort to personal judgment in these situations. Sound judgment is difficult to make in the absence of clear-cut, relevant data or an obvious path. The objective of this proposed rationale is thus to be able to trace a clear path of good judgment by gaining knowledge on three main aspects of a conservation object. Based upon the trail of thought here present, these can be identified as aesthetic aspect, the meaning of value, and material preservation. Upon collection and examination of this information, the multifaceted cultural significance of the object under study can be brought into focus. This essentially is an approach which induces the conservation professional to first stop and analyze the value, balancing tangible and intangible values of the three dimensions prior to taking any decisions on whether one aspect should be prioritized over the others. The process to reach the aim is broken down into the following objectives, that is, firstly gathering knowledge on the aesthetic parameters, the value in meaning, and the parameters of material preservation. The required knowledge can be gained by tapping into historical sources as well as recently published literature and archival sources, art historical appraisals, aided by consultation with experts in the field, and further research into the social aspects of such conservation objects within the communities that enjoy their custodianship. Notions of collective memory, identity, and narrative values are also to be explored. An in-depth scientific study of the conservation object should also be undertaken, wherein the current conditions are assessed. The survey, an essential component of this strategy, is designed to determine the physical state and the future needs of the object. Secondly, one must go about transforming this knowledge specifically gathered for the object being studied into an understanding through the application of a thought-in process. The gathered information is to be organized into three columns, namely aesthetics, meaning, and preservation, and weighing of the importance of each for this particular object thus calculated. A ratio is to be extrapolated, giving a visual cue to the relationship between the three dimensions. The professional would thus be in a better position to take guide decisions on what need to be valorized when such artifacts find themselves in a subject of discussion. This formulated guided approach, a tool in the hands of the conservation professional, would reduce the risk of taking decisions based solely on personal judgments which may contain a bias. Conclusion. The key in this process of knowledge gathering and interpretation, which is too often conducted superficially by the conservation specialists without involving stakeholders, by adopting this approach, the primary goal of the conservation strategy being designed becomes ensuring continuity of the object, including its living heritage value, together with its more familiar documentary or historical heritage values. It also makes it clear that dialogue among stakeholders is to be prioritized rather than following a prescriptive code of practice, which may limit the adaptation to context and personalization. When applying this proposed methodology, the conservation professional is guided towards achieving a bespoke conservation strategy for the needs of the individual object under study. By defining both the needs of the religious community and those of the conservation world, conservation professionals can help to identify options of reconciling needs, to define good practice, and ultimately to build confidence and trust amongst all partners. Thank you very much.
First of all, this is me and not my president, and I would like to express my personal thanks to Professor Agius and Professor De Giorgio for the invitation to this excellent edition of the European Cathedrals Conference. And furthermore, as I know very well the effort behind the organization machine, I would like to give a special thanks to the staff involved in the planning of these 2 days. So congratulations for this great achievement. The site where the Piazza del Duomo di Pisa stands today has seen its morphology and functions change several times over the centuries. Its location is off-center with respect to the old city and its walls. Despite this, it has been the fulcrum of the civil and the religious life of the community since its very beginning. The genesis of the site began in 1064 with the foundation of the new cathedral. Throughout the Middle Ages, at the height of Pisa's economic and maritime power, the sacred place was enriched with monumental buildings, whose functionality was explicitly linked to the spiritual path of the community. The cathedral, to bring God's family together in communion, its bell tower to mark the phases of the day and prayer with the tolling of the bells, a baptistry for the sacrament of baptism and the Christian's entrance into the community, and finally a cemetery for burial. The process of laying out a real square was only completed during the 19th century with the creation of a uniform, leveled turf lined by regular paths. What makes this square unique today? Monumental white marble buildings laid on the green lawn. In almost 1,000 years of history, many are the hands that first built and then took care of the Pisan monumental complex. 1,000 years of history in which the Opera della Primaziale Pisana has been responsible for preserving and handing down. Having survived many vicissitudes, depending at times on civil and at times on religious authority, the Opera della Primaziale Pisana has preserved not only the material, but also an intangible culture, full of meanings and made of knowledge and traditions, still the heritage of its workers, even in a modern way. Today, as then, the opera takes care of the property, which was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. This privileged status brings with it the duty to pass on to the future generations this treasure. It is a legacy that has to be preserved along with its outstanding universal value, its attributes so exceptional to transcend national borders and become a universal heritage, subject to permanent protection. As stated in the motivation, the Piazza del Duomo is not only a representation of man's creative genius, but also bears witness to the fruitful interchange of human values, which in the Republican Pisa comprised cultures, knowledge, and technologies from the Mediterranean basin and the areas of commercial influence of the city. It was here, in the building site of the cathedral, that a distinctive alphabet was formed, a special and sophisticated combination of styles blended in a perfect balance. In the cathedral square, the Romanesque style, which is the expression of a culture with a strong Christian matrix, is declined in a language capable of embracing components of other cultures, which are interlaced in the cathedral building site in an atmosphere of mutual interaction. To codify this extraordinary achievement, historiography has thus introduced an adjective, Pisan, to the Romanesque style, and there are remarkable proofs of the impact that it had on the development of religious architecture in Tuscany and on the shores of Corsica and Sardinia. At the beginning, the magnificence of the monumental buildings was the symbol of the civil grandeur of the Maritime Republic of Pisa, combined, to use the words of our Archbishop, Monsignor Benotto, to the power of the mystery of salvation that they released as a space for the celebration of worship. In the mid-18th century, a new vocation of the monumental complex began to take shape, with the inclusion of Pisa among the essential destinations of the Grand Tour, the educational one. Many are the tributes of famous travelers who grasp the singularity and then also the magnificence of the Pisan monumental complex. And while the educational value of such a triumph of beauty was celebrated by the European cultural elite and declined according to national temperaments, a feeling of protection increasingly arose, a feeling that goes beyond the traditional approach experienced for centuries. It was the birth of the concept of museum, a collection of artworks decontextualized from their place of origin, often precisely to ensure their preservation. At the beginning of the 19th century, the first collector's intent emerged. It was outlined with the first public museum of Pisan glories and ancient art, protected by the walls of the cemetery and run by Carlo Lasinio, who was its conservator. Increasingly a territory of culture and education, the Pisan site now waves entertainment and recreation into its educational purpose. In short, we are talking about mass tourism. Over time, new stakeholders are increasingly emerging. They add legal, scientific, and administrative values to the cultural and devotional ones. Each of them forms the background and, to some extent, affect the planning and conservation choices of the Opera della Primaziale Pisana, that has to translate the complex system of values into concrete, everyday actions, and, going even further, planning action that embrace a broader time horizon. Today, the monumental complex, with its around 9 hectares and more than 30,000 square meters of marble surface, preserves its exceptional universal value. This is also due to the continuity in its management. Integrity, together with authenticity, is subject to regular monitoring by UNESCO through the periodic report. As site manager, we are now affording the third cycle of periodic reporting, whose purpose is certainly to verify the state of preservation of the monumental buildings, but above all, their attributes, both material and immaterial, that have converged in the statement of universal value. The opera's charter codifies in a few lines its mission, which over time has seen many changes, even though in its substantial continuity. The very denomination of the main institutional offices has been preserved over the centuries. Even today, the president is defined as operaio, to emphasize the operational functions of the making, of building the monumental architectures then, of preserving them today. The maestranze are still the operational arm of this daily doing, guided then by a capo delle maestranze, and we have famous figures such as Nicola and Giovanni Pisano among them, and today coordinated by a technical director. The selection of increasingly qualified personnel makes the opera's restoration team the fulcrum of a constant monitoring of the monumental site. Daily attendance, the expert gaze of our operators, combined with procedures that are increasingly oriented towards a scientific approach, are the key to keeping this huge heritage safe. A methodology that has rapidly changed over the last 20 years and that today makes the Opera della Primaziale Pisana capable of managing the cultural heritage under its protection by itself. The question of the autonomy of a Fabbriceria that is halfway between public and private is a matter of not little relevance. The Ministry of the Interior appoints the members of the deputation and reviews the annual budget and the way the accounts are kept. The Ministry of Cultural Heritage checks the state of conservation of the site and the artifacts it contains and gives its advice on proposed conservation activity, certifies then the results of restoration work carried out. But how do we manage such an expensive machine? The first source of revenue is the entrance fee to the monuments. It represents 80–90%. We may say that this is a sort of circular system, and tourism is the primary source on which the entire system is based. In turn, the system gives back to the same source, that is, to our visitors, the possibility of enjoying the site and its beauty every day, of satisfying their cultural needs, and, we hope, of taking home the memory of a full and pleasant encounter with a heritage that represents a universal legacy. At the same time, the distribution of expenditure reflects rather closely the mission of the Opera della Primaziale Pisana with its 4 pillars: preserve, maintain, hand down, and enhance. So on the left side of the slide, I've listed the activities, the restoration sites that are running in these days within the boundary of the site. Although universal, the Cathedral Square contains a heritage of art and culture that is often alien to our visitors. This is a point that cannot be ignored. about 1 visitor in 4 sets out to visit the monumental complex of Pisa, we may say, without the necessary tools for a full understanding of all the values it contains, and we may say with expectations that must somehow be taken into account. Our effort, then, is oriented in setting up comprehensible communication systems and in suggesting a clear reading of the contents and the values expressed by the heritage of the Piazza del Duomo. Now I give the floor to my colleague Giulia Scolari, but she will guide us through the monumental cemetery and its various significance. I would just like to mention what is the next challenge that Opera della Primaziale Pisana is facing, together with a committee of experts and architects. This is the birth of a new archaeological museum enclosed in the cemetery. This is an opportunity to develop a communication campaign that will make clear to all visitors, despite cultural differences, the many values of this monumental building, which houses one of the most majestic fresco cycles, continues to be a place of burial and reflection, and is an essential part of the Pisa museum system. Thank you.
The monumental Camposanto is part of the faith path represented by the Piazza dei Miracoli as the final act of the believer's life and the beginning of his journey towards eternal life. Its religious significance makes it the exemplary case for the theme of this conference, dedicated to the delicate balance between preservation and spirituality. It embodies a multiple function. It is at the same time a graveyard, a reliquary, and a museum. Founded in 1277 to house the tombs of religious and major city figures, it was designed as a place spacious and decorous, secluded and enclosed, and can be considered as a huge reliquary to treasure the holy earth of Palestine. Since its origins, it represents a place of reflection on eternal life, but also on earthly life. The frescoes are closely linked to the fundamental stages of the salvific path and translate their message, appealing to the imagination of the faithful. In the mid-14th century, with the spread of the plague, man feels disarmed. Death strikes anyone indiscriminately and without warning, and the need to understand what happens to the soul immediately after its separation from the body grows. People rely on sermons and doctrine, but it's not enough. Therefore, the Church involves art in order to communicate through images. The internal walls of the Camposanto are decorated with numerous frescoes meant to inspire the faithful, educate, and admonish him. Camposanto frescoes depict the story of the Pisan saints and stories from the Old Testament, representing a warning and a source of inspiration for the faithfuls, and have become one of the largest pictorial cycles of the 15th century and of all times. The frescoes that most of all sum up the path to salvation is probably the cycle of the triumph of death, consisting of 3 scenes. The first fresco depicts the lives of the Holy Fathers who fight demonic temptation in the desert. It was accompanied by vernacular inscription, unfortunately now lost, suggesting the proper behavior to the faithful aspiring to eternal life. The second scene depicts the last judgment and hell, showing the outcomes of a righteous life and those of a sinful life. This sequence of depiction culminates in the last scene, representing the triumph of death, where the faithful becomes aware that the passing away can occur at any time and strike whomever. Unfortunately, towards the end of the Second World War, a grenade hit the roof of the building, triggering a terrible fire that devastated the monument and the works of art. The complex iconographic composition intimately linked to the architectural structure, which constituted a uniqueness representing the religious and artistic identity, was totally disrupted. Thanks to the following restoration work, although precarious and experimental, the painted surfaces that can be seen today were saved. The frescoes were promptly torn off and transferred to asbestos cement panels. For conservation reasons, only the Triumph of Death cycle was exhibited in a hall next to the cemetery, but most of the frescoes were confined to a warehouse. This is why a commission of experts was established in the 1990s to start a new restoration project aimed at returning the wall paintings to their original location, thus reconstructing the religious identity of the monument, ensuring high conservation standards. The complex restoration work had to face the multiple aspects related to the frescoes and the location that would house them. In collaboration with the CNR in Bologna, campaigns were carried out to study and monitor the building's internal microclimate in order to diagnose and counteract possible sources of environmental degradation. At the same time, an intervention protocol had to be put in place that would allow us to solve the problems generated by previous restorations and mainly related to the materials. In fact, the frescoes had been torn off using animal glues that hadn't been completely removed from the painted surfaces, and then applied to asbestos cement panels, which with calcium caseate. Over the years, this solution has caused detachments of the pictorial film due to the hygroscopicity of the animal glue and color changes due to the migration of the lime contained in the caseate. In addition, the asbestos cement supports, which were no longer suitable due to their composition, had to be replaced. Thanks to the aid of the University of Molise and the use of bacteria, we were able to remove the residual animal glue that was deteriorating the surface. Then the frescoes were detached from the asbestos cement panels and applied to more suitable supports. Finally, we had to think of a proper technology to relocate the frescoes on the wall while counteracting the problems related to the microclimate of a semi-confined environment. A long phase of experimentation followed, ranging from fiberglass panels to aerolam that was finally adopted as the support for the frescoes. Thanks to this material, it was possible to apply from behind a thermal sheet which hits the surface but 1 degree over the room temperature, prevents condensation, and significantly limits the deposition of atmospheric particulate. The Commission, appointed to follow the complex phases of the restoration works over the years involved renewed personality, such as Umberto Baldini, Antonio Paolucci, and expert restorers such as Gianluigi Colalucci, Carlo Giantomasi, and Donatella Zari. They were supported by a scientific committee composed of the University of Molise and the chemistry department of the University of Pisa. This multidisciplinary approach has made it possible to restore not only the lost physical integrity, but also the identity of the monumental cemetery and renew the artistic and religious value dramatically lost due to the fire event. The frescoes are now constantly monitored by the restorers of the Opera Primaziale Pisana in order to verify inside microclimatic trend ensured by the advanced technologies adopted and the stability of the colors. The protocol of plant maintenance is constantly evolving with the aim of guaranteeing the high conservation standards that the recovery and relocation project had set. Today, the Camposanto maintains its multiple liturgical, educational, cultural, scientific, and museum vocation. It is both a place devoted to burial and reflection and a great collection of antiquities, which are nowadays the subject for further study in sight to their placement in a new archaeological museum. I take my leave with a short video showing the final relocation stages of the frescoes to their original site, bringing back, we hope at least, part of the original spiritual significance of such an incredible monument, which keep on speaking the unspeakable to further generation. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to introduce myself first. I am from Yeditepe University in Istanbul. I was a participant of ICROM in 1993 in the architectural conservation course and also in the stone conservation course in 1999 and also in the course of wood conservation in Norway. It was in 1996. So I have so many experience in Italy, and I saw so many studies in the area, in Rome, in Venice. Today I would like to talk about conservation of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. At the beginning, I would like, dear Cathedral Museum curators, conservators, and academicians, thanks for the invitation of St. John's Co-Cathedral Fountain to be able to join this meeting to share knowledge, research, and good practices on how to reconcile the continuity of faith and scientific technical conservation. The word Sophia was a term that was used to reference Jesus as a part of God's wisdom. Later, it was known as the Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, or the Lord's Wisdom, in honor of his mother. Hagia Sophia's early basilican form was constructed by Constantine I as an example of the Romans' first Christian church. Of course, the story will start very early, and you see the Roman Empire is a big empire. After the Roman Empire was divided into two regions, East and West, in 385, you know, Constantinople was the capital of the west of the Roman Empire. Constantinople, Istanbul, was under the control of the following governments in the history: Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Eastern Roman. Later, there period Latin Empire for 57 years, and then Ottoman Empire, Republic of Turkey, beginning 1923. You see where is Istanbul and where is the location of the Byzantine. And when we see the map of the Istanbul, you can see there is a very historic peninsula, and there are some city walls in relation with the Byzantine Empire. And at the beginning, of course, there was an Acropole. You can see the black part. You see there is an Acropole at the beginning, and then later there are some walls, the second walls also. Istanbul was of course, Constantinople was a big city. Roman time, you can see, there was a hippodrome here, there was a hippodrome here, and the Hagia Sophia was here, the early Hagia Irene here, and St. John Cathedral, I believe that, it was in that location. There are hippodrome, there are some stories in relation with hippodrome. You know, this horse was brought to Venice by the occupation, during the occupation of Crusaders in 1203. They are now in the Venice. In the Venice, you see this is the building of the San Marco Cathedral,
Yes, Saint Mark-
and the
Saint
facade
Mark's
of
of
the Cathedral of San Marco, and also this horses now in the Vatican, Venice, sorry. And you know, there is an occupation of Ottoman, and after that you can see Hippodrome and Hagia Sophia together in the. There is a purposed planning that you see. Red one is Roman and Byzantine time. From the green part is from Ottoman period. They are in a superposition. You see, as you see, and we can see the Hippodrome here. Hippodrome, Sultanahmet Mosque, Hagia Sophia, Hagia Irene, St. John is around here, but you cannot see easy. This is the today's situation. Also, you know, there are some cisterns in Istanbul, so many cisterns. One of them is near the Hagia Sophia, and this is very famous today. You can see some stones that in this cistern. You can see also some stones belong to previous cultures in Istanbul, in Constantinople. So this is another, shows the Great Palace of Constantinople and Hagia Sophia, and Hagia Sophia, here, Hagia Irene, and St. John Cathedral studio was here, Basilica together here, and this is the period of course, Great Palace period. It cannot be seen in other converted building that conserves the original name. In 1483, Sultan Muhammad, the conquest of designed a booklet, Vakfiye, which has got the richest incomes for the management of the building. According to these original financial documents, incomes will use not only for the maintenance of the building, which needs the consolidation and restoration, but also effort for the new construction to support for the future generations. It is among, I don't want to read everything, and I would like to show something. You see, this is a basilica planning. In one of them is Catholic, the Orthodox, I think. There are types, and you see, Hagia Sophia has a unique planning character. It's very early because there are basilica and also domed basilica type. It was built about 5037, but there are so many earthquakes, and there are rebuilt again, and after so many earthquakes, there are some supporting walls also on the structure. You can see there are some supporting. There are some supporting walls on the structure, and there are some constructions near the church. This was basic basilica plan characteristic. There are some nifs, that 3 nifs basilica. There are the main nif, and there are 2 more nifs, and atrium is a basic basilica plan character. And this basilical shape has a dome in the central plan shape, in the Hagia Sophia also. And when we look at the spatial configuration of the Hagia Sophia, spatial configuration, you can see there are some early basilicas that they have some central plan character. And there is a basilica near Hagia Sophia. This is very early. It was built before Hagia Sophia, and you can see there is a central character. And also there is another basilica that I said before, St. John's Studio. The mix of these plan characteristics can be seen in the Hagia Sophia. And it has a linguistic plan characteristics, and you see there are pendentives also on the transition elements. This is a specific characteristic of the building. Well, it is very interesting. You see that in this building also there are so many pictures. But Hagia Sophia, you can see mosaics, material in the paintings. And when we analyze the pictures also, they are very unique and they have some early characteristics. They are untouched and they are very unique. There isn't any addition in Baroque time or on the 16th, 17th or the late periods. These are just 15th century mosaic painting decoration. So it is very unique and very protected. I can't say that it's very good, conserved with the original, protected in the original form and material. Also, there are some mosaics on the other parts of the gate decoration. And we can analyze the figures also. For example, in the face of the Virgin, you can see there are some art historians says that they are belong to different period, but the artist of the model of the artist, if you analyze, they are very similar in that I can say that the pictures reflects the culture, the pictures, these mosaic pictures can show the material, the way of the construction of the paintings, of the mosaics, and also you can see the face of the people. For example, this is Komnenos period, and the lady is a reddish color of hair, and also the baby and the mother also has the face different culture. You can see the change of the culture in the picture also. Anyhow, there are so many mosaics that we can analyze in deep. We can analyze the figures, we can analyze the forms, we can analyze the everything. You can material, techniques, everything can be analyzed. And it is good that you can say that this is 15th century or 16th century, but everything is before 15th century, not later. And then, of course, Byzantine architecture has a unique place in the history of the European architecture. History, for example, when we look to Hellenistic, Roman, early Christian, Armenian, Byzantine branches, Byzantine was affected Renaissance, Baroque and Rococo. After occupation of Istanbul, some Byzantine architects and artists were moved to the West, and they created a new period in the late Renaissance. Perhaps they are affected the Baroque also. After occupation, after what happened to Hagia Sophia, we can see now. Of course, occupation of Istanbul is important for us. It was not easy for the people, and they occupied. They used so many ways to occupation, and then when Turks found Istanbul, about 50 churches, most of which were in ruins, some of government halls, and ruins of social institutions, which had dropped away because of the lack of the attention, and also abandoned place, underground water courses, cisterns, and the deteriorated columns that once adorned two squares. Ottoman Turks started to improve the city immediately to create a new Muslim capital. They wanted converted the mosques in Istanbul to the converted to the mosque. The church was converted to the mosque. You can see they are now they are active as a mosque. Hagia Sophia, at the beginning, Hagia Sophia was at the beginning there was a single minaret, and later during the second Selim in 16th century there is a big restoration by architect Sinan. And at that period, three more minarets was added, and now there are 4 minarets to in the Hagia Sophia. And when we analyze these constructions, I can say that this, and also architect Sinan says that they tried to conserve the building very well, and the minarets will also support the diagonal forces for the deformation of the construction, because the Hagia Sophia also has problems. So many after earthquakes, there are some expansion on the dome, and there are some problems on the structure. So when you see the tombs of the new tombs of the belong to the Ottoman Empire, supporting the recenses of the structure, stability of the structure. It's, we can say easy, that is a good additions that supports the Hagia Sophia, that they say it survives still today. So also in that period, there are some additions to the supporting walls. At the beginning also there were some supporting walls, but during the restoration in 16th century, that was done by architect Sinan, also was supporting the supporting walls. You can see there are so many additions to the original structure, but all of them is around the structure, but it is not closing the structure, and always they are supporting for the stabilization of the structure. There are so many additions to the area near the Hagia Sophia. Inside of the Hagia Sophia also there are some new furnitures relation with the mosque, because it was of course the important things, mosaics, covering of the mosaics. I didn't say it was very important. After occupation of Istanbul, the mosaics of the Byzantine mosaics was covered with a plaster, and they used as a mosque, of course, because in the religious, if you are using as a mosque this building, you cannot use a figure inside of the building. And out of the building, there are some tombs that they wanted to be built the tombs here. This was important area for us every time. These are new additions. New, it's not new, of course, 18th, 16th, 19th century additions. Decoration elements, relation with the mosque. And you see, there are also some inspiration from Hagia Sophia, because Hagia Sophia has a very big dome. And architect Sinan created a complex for Sultan Süleyman in 16th century. It is very surprised that the plan is the same of the Hagia Sophia. You can analyze that the plan is like a Hagia Sophia plan. The section also similar with Hagia Sophia, but in the this is Hagia Sophia, this is Sultan Süleyman Mosque. But it's very strange that the architect Sinan used the plan of the Hagia Sophia, but in the form is different from a basilica. So it was a basilica, but this is a central plan-shaped mosque. On the other hand, you can see this is the similarities Ayasofya and Sultan Süleyman Mosque. This is the Sultan Süleyman Mosque. Similarities in the plan. This is the Ayasofya, you see. And also, architect Sinan created a dome in Selimiye, and he said that this dome is bigger than Ayasofya. He tried a big building with a single dome, and this dome size was bigger than Ayasofya. He tried to create a bigger dome than Ayasofya in Selimiye in Edirne. As you see, today there are some places that there are superposed decorative ornamentation. Perhaps on the dome there are some pantocrator figures, but today there are some calligraphic inscriptions. But pendentif, the figure of the pendentif was removed in 6 or 7 years before, and it was very strange for us, of course, to see the angel face in the pendentif. There are so many restoration studies. One of them is Fossati brothers' restoration in the 18th century. It was the Sinan restoration wasn't a single restoration. In 18th century also, there is another restoration that was done by Fossati brothers. During the restoration, 6 Patrick mosaics in the eastern Petiporium as drawn by the Fossati brothers. We always go to see the mosaics, analyze the building, and to see something. There are some studies in the 12th century for the conservation. For example, the deep cracks have been observed by the technical monitoring system by the financial support of the World Monuments Fund in 1996. The deteriorated lead roof had caused water leaking down over the fragile frescoes and mosaics. With the help of financial service company American Express, for the restoration of the dome, they created some studies. Structural stabilization and repair of the crack of the roof have been realized by the Turkish Ministry of Culture in the 12th century studies. And you can see today there are some open mosaics that you can see, and some of them was covered by the, for example, I can show the covered mosaics. In the apsis, you can see there is this is the direction also. This direction also, the mean direction for the praying in the mosque. So we cannot see the picture, so there are some covers like this today. And perhaps I can say the valid contribution of all periods to the building of a monument must be respected, since unity of the style is not the aim of the restoration. When a building includes the superimposed works of different periods, the revealing of the underlying state can only be justified in exceptional circumstances, and what is removed is of little interest, and the material which is brought to light is of great historical, archaeological, or aesthetic value, and its state of preservation good enough to justify the action. Evaluation of the importance of the elements involved and the decision as to what may be destroyed cannot rest solely on the individual in charge of the work. Conservation of cultural heritage is a multi-faced discipline. Pupils' commitment to their cultural heritage, their relations with the integrated, intangible aspects of the cultural assets. Multi-layered cultural assets require an unhindered access to cultural heritage, connected to the various beliefs and traditions. Multi-layered shared cultural heritage requires their participation in contemporary life to be designed and implemented with the tolerance and empathy. And thanks to architects Antimonus and Isidore, who built such a unique design and construction that has survived through so many disasters, and it is still standing for nearly 14th century. And thanks to Ottoman Empire, who ordered to protect Ayasofya for the future generations. Thank you.